Sometimes life strips away everything we hold dear, leaving us with nothing but our character and the skills we've earned through hardship. In the dusty town of Cedar Falls, a broken man named Wes Carter was about to discover that losing everything can sometimes be the first step to finding who you really are. Everett Langley, the richest rancher in the territory, had just challenged this penniless drifter to ride Hellfire, a massive wild stallion that had never been broken. The whole town gathered to watch what they expected would be a disaster, but Carter approached that corral with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced worse odds before. As he placed his weathered hand on the gate, something stirred in his eyes that made the crowd fall silent. What they were about to witness would change everything they thought they knew about courage, skill, and the power of a determined heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Falls in 1887 was the kind of town where a man's reputation traveled faster than his horse, and Everett Langley's reputation cast a shadow longer than the spire of the white-steepled church on Main Street. The Lazy L Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of prime Colorado territory, its borders marked by miles of sturdy fencing and guarded by men whose loyalty could be bought with steady wages and the kind of respect that comes from working for the most powerful man in 3 counties. Langley himself stood 6 feet tall in his custom-made boots, with silver threading through his dark hair and a gold pocket watch that caught the morning sun like a beacon of prosperity. That watch had belonged to his father and his father before him, each tick marking another moment in the family's rise, from struggling homesteaders to cattle barons. He wore it proudly, checking it often, as if time itself bent to his will. The inscription on its back read, "Time and tide wait for no man," but Everett Langley had spent the better part of 20 years proving that motto wrong. In Cedar Falls, time waited for Everett Langley. The town itself had grown up around the Lazy L like a flower following the sun. Main Street boasted a proper hotel with real glass windows, a general store that stocked goods from as far east as St. Louis, and the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Martha Kellerman served the finest whiskey this side of Denver. Doc Henley had his practice in a 2-story building with painted shutters, and Sheriff Jack Morrison kept the peace from an office that rarely saw much trouble beyond the occasional cowhand drinking too much on payday. It was a good life for those who minded their place and showed proper respect to the man who made it all possible. Langley employed 60 men year-round, and during roundup season, that number doubled. Their families shopped at the general store, their children attended the schoolhouse, and their wives gathered at the church socials, where Langley's donations kept the coffers full and the preacher's sermons appropriately grateful. But prosperity had bred a certain expectation in Everett Langley, a belief that his word carried the weight of natural law. When he spoke, men listened. When he suggested, they acted. When he disapproved, changes were made quickly and without argument. This arrangement had served him well for 2 decades, which made the events of 3 days ago all the more troubling. The stranger had arrived on a Tuesday, riding a tired bay mare and leading a pack horse that had seen better years. Wes Carter looked like 1,000 other drifters who passed through cattle country weathered face, clothes that spoke of hard travel and harder times, boots that had walked more miles than most men could count. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He'd spoken politely to the livery owner, paid for his horse's care with coins that appeared to be his last, and taken a room at the hotel that he clearly couldn't afford for more than a night or 2. Nobody paid much attention to one more down-on-his-luck cowboy passing through. They were common as tumbleweeds, these men who'd lost their way or their luck or both, drifting from town to town looking for work that might restore some dignity to lives that had taken too many hard turns. Most moved on quickly, sensing in the prosperity of Cedar Falls a contentment that had no room for their particular brand of desperation. But Wes Carter had lingered, and in his lingering, He'd made himself known in a way that sat poorly with Everett Langley's sense of natural order. It happened outside the general store, where old Miguel Santos was trying to load supplies onto his rickety wagon, while his grandson, Pablo, a boy of perhaps 10 years, struggled with a sack of flour too heavy for his small frame. Miguel worked a hard-scrabble piece of land south of town, barely scratching out enough to feed his family, let alone prosper. Langley tolerated his presence because the old Mexican caused no trouble, and his daughter Maria did fine needlework for the hotel. 3 of Langley's men, Chuck Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, and 2 others, whose names were less important than their loyalty, had been drinking since noon and found entertainment in the boys' struggle. Their laughter grew louder as Pablo stumbled, the flour sack splitting and sending white powder across the dusty street. The boy's face burned with embarrassment as his grandfather hurried to help, speaking rapid Spanish that needed no translation to convey his distress. That was when the stranger stepped in. "Easy there, son," Wes Carter had said, his voice carrying a gentleness that spoke of experience with frightened animals and younger brothers. He lifted the torn sack as if it weighed nothing, transferring the remaining flour to a spare cloth bag from the store. "Happens to the best of us." Chuck Morrison had found this intervention amusing. "Well, look here, boys. We got ourselves a hero." His words carried the particular cruelty of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Mexican lover, are you, stranger?" Carter had straightened slowly, and those who witnessed it later said something shifted in his bearing, like a wolf rising from peaceful rest. But his voice remained calm, measured. "Just lending a hand to a neighbor." "Neighbor?" Chuck's laugh was sharp and ugly. "These people ain't neighbors, friend. They're barely tolerated. And strangers who don't know their place sometimes find themselves moving on faster than they planned." The confrontation might have ended there, with Carter backing down as Chuck expected, as any sensible drifter would when faced with the reality of local power. Instead, Carter had done something that would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years to come. He'd smiled not with humor, but with the patient expression of a schoolteacher about to deliver a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. "I expect you're right about some folks not knowing their place," Carter had said, his words soft as silk and twice as smooth. "Fortunately, I learned mine a long time ago." What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but would echo through the town like thunder through a canyon. Carter had moved with a speed and precision that seemed to bend the laws of nature, disarming Chuck Morrison of both his gun and his dignity before the younger man could draw breath to protest. Chuck found himself sitting in the dust, staring up at his own Colt Peacemaker, which Carter held with the casual familiarity of a man born to such tools. "Your place," Carter had continued in that same conversational tone, "is helping your neighbors when they need it, not making sport of their troubles. Your grandfather would be ashamed of what you've become." He'd handed the gun back butt first, tipped his hat to Miguel and Pablo, and walked away as if nothing remarkable had occurred. But the damage was done. Chuck Morrison was the sheriff's nephew, one of Langley's men, and a representative of the established order. To humiliate him publicly was to challenge something far larger than one man's pride. Word reached Everett Langley within the hour, carried by witnesses whose loyalty was unquestioned, but whose storytelling grew more dramatic with each telling. By sunset, half the town believed the stranger had magical powers, while the other half whispered that he must be running from something terrible to take such risks with men like Chuck Morrison. Langley himself had listened to the reports with the careful attention of a man accustomed to weighing information like a banker counts gold. The stranger's skill with weapons suggested military training. His defense of the Mexican family indicated either foolish nobility or dangerous principles. Most concerning of all, his calm dismissal of local power structures hinted at a man who either didn't understand the consequences of his actions or didn't care about them. Both possibilities presented problems for Everett Langley, whose authority rested on the understanding that crossing him carried a price too steep for any reasonable man to pay. As he sat in his mahogany-panelled study that evening, brandy warming his belly and firelight dancing across the gold face of his pocket watch, Langley had made a decision that seemed as natural as breathing. The stranger would be taught his place, publicly and memorably, in a way that would restore the proper order of things and remind everyone in Cedar Falls that some men commanded respect while others begged for mercy. The challenge would be issued tomorrow, witnessed by the entire town, with stakes that no drifter could refuse and odds that no sane man would accept. It would be educational for everyone involved, a reminder that prosperity and power were not achieved by coddling every sad story that rode into town, looking for handouts and sympathy. Everett Langley had smiled as he closed his watch, secure in the knowledge that some lessons were best taught by example, and some examples were best made of men who forgot their place in the world's natural order. After all, time and tide waited for no man except perhaps the ones wise enough to own the clocks. The morning sun painted Main Street gold when Everett Langley stepped out of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his polished boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk with the measured rhythm of a man who owned every plank beneath his feet. Behind him, Martha Kellerman watched through her window, a dish towel forgotten in her hands as she sensed the weight of the moment settling over her town like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Langley had positioned himself with theatrical precision, knowing that within minutes word would spread through Cedar Falls faster than wildfire through dry grass. The stranger, Wes Carter, as he'd signed the hotel register, was having breakfast at the small table outside the general store, a simple meal of biscuits and coffee that spoke to the limitations of his purse. His worn leather gloves lay beside his plate, and even from a distance, Langley could see the careful way the man ate, as if every bite was considered, every movement economical. A small crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by some invisible current that flows through small towns when important moments approach. Doc Henley emerged from his office, medical bag in hand, as if he'd been expecting trouble. Sheriff Morrison appeared at his doorway, hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt. Chuck Morrison slouched against a hitching post, his face still bearing the shadow of yesterday's humiliation. "Mr. Carter," Langley called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Carter looked up from his breakfast, chewing slowly before setting down his fork with deliberate care. "Mr. Langley." "Good morning to you." His voice held no surprise, no anxiety, just the polite acknowledgement of one man greeting another. "I don't recall having any business between us." "Oh, but you do." Langley stepped into the street, his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, the gold chain of his pocket watch catching the sunlight. "Yesterday, you took it upon yourself to interfere with my men, to embarrass them, to suggest that their behavior was somehow inappropriate. I suggested that making sport of a child's struggles was beneath any man worth the name." Carter's response came without heat, a simple statement of fact delivered in the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. The crowd murmured at this, sensing the undercurrent of challenge flowing between the two men like electricity before lightning strikes. Martha Kellerman had stepped onto her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Miguel Santos appeared at the corner of the general store, his grandson Pablo peering around his grandfather's legs with wide, worried eyes. "Is that so?" Langley's smile held no warmth, just the satisfied expression of a cat that had cornered a particularly interesting mouse. "And I suppose you consider yourself qualified to judge what is and isn't beneath a man." "I consider myself qualified to recognize decency when I see it," Carter replied, "and to recognize its absence just as clearly." The insult hung in the morning air like gun smoke, and Langley felt a thrill of satisfaction. The stranger had just provided him with all the justification he needed for what was to come. Strong words, from a man wearing clothes that have seen better decades, and boots that have walked more roads than they have miles left in them. Carter stood slowly, his movements unhurried despite the growing tension. A man's worth isn't measured by the shine on his boots or the weight of his purse. Mr. Langley, I thought a successful rancher might have learned that by now. And I thought a drifter might have learned when to keep his opinions to himself. Langley's voice hardened, the pretense of civility falling away like a discarded mask. But since you seem to think you're qualified to judge my men, perhaps you'd care to prove yourself worthy of that judgment. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was about to happen would become part of Cedar Falls folklore, the kind of story that would be told and retold until truth and legend became indistinguishable. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly at their hitching posts. "What did you have in mind?" Carter asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Langley's smile returned, broader now, touched with genuine pleasure. "I have a horse, a stallion I acquired from a ranch up north that went under when the owner couldn't manage him. Hellfire, they call him. 15 hands of pure fury and storm. He's broken 3 corrals, injured 7 men, and never had a saddle on his back for more than 10 seconds. In Sheriff Morrison's desk, forgotten beneath a stack of wanted posters and official correspondence, lay a crumpled piece of paper that had arrived months ago from the Territorial Marshal's office. The poster bore the faded image of a man whose description might have matched any of 100 drifters, except for the unusual detail about his way with horses. But the sheriff had filed it away, distracted by local concerns and the comfortable assumption that famous men didn't wander into quiet towns like Cedar Falls. "And you want me to try to ride him?" Carter said. It wasn't a question. "I want you to prove that all your noble talk about what men should and shouldn't do extends to your own actions. Hellfire hasn't been ridden because he can't be ridden. But if you think you're qualified to judge the character of my men, surely you're qualified to handle one horse." The crowd had grown to include nearly every soul in Cedar Falls, drawn by whispered words and the irresistible pull of witnessing something that would be remembered long after they were gone. Maria Santos had appeared beside her father, her dark eyes fixed on Carter, with an expression that seemed to carry equal parts worry and hope. "And if I refuse?" Carter asked. "Then you'll discover that Cedar Falls isn't as welcoming to strangers who don't know their place as it might seem. Pack your horse and leave town before noon, with the understanding that you're not welcome to return." Carter was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the table as he considered the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Leave town branded as a coward, or stay and face a challenge that seemed designed to end in disaster. Either way, Langley won, and everyone knew it. "And if I accept?" Carter asked. "Then you ride Hellfire. If you can stay on his back for 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, I'll acknowledge that you're the man you claim to be. I'll make sure my men know to treat all our neighbors with proper respect." Langley's voice carried across the crowd, ensuring that everyone heard the terms. "But if you can't ride him, if you get thrown like every other man who's tried, then you'll acknowledge publicly that you spoke out of turn, apologize to Chuck and the others, and leave town the same day." It was a clever trap, designed to eliminate the stranger either through humiliation or injury, while allowing Langley to appear reasonable and fair. 2 minutes seemed generous to those who didn't know horses, while those who did know them understood it was an impossible ask. Hellfire had never allowed a man to mount him, let alone stay mounted. Carter picked up his worn leather gloves, pulling them on with the careful attention of a man preparing for serious work. The gloves were old, the leather soft and shaped by years of use, carrying the kind of familiarity that comes only from tools that have become extensions of a craftsman's hands. 2 minutes, Carter said finally, "and if I manage it, your men treat everyone in this town with the respect they deserve." "When do we do this?" Langley asked, confident now that victory was within his grasp. "No time like the present," Carter replied, standing and placing a silver dollar on the table to pay for his breakfast. "Lead the way to your horse, Mr. Langley." As the crowd began to move toward the corrals behind the livery stable, Martha Kellerman found herself walking beside Doc Henley. "This feels wrong, Doc," she whispered. "That man doesn't seem like the type to take on impossible odds for the sake of pride." Doc Henley adjusted his medical bag, already mentally cataloguing the supplies he might need. "Maybe it's not about pride, Martha. Maybe some men just can't stand by when they see injustice, regardless of the cost. Or maybe," she replied, watching Carter walk with that same unhurried confidence he'd shown since arriving in town, "some men know things the rest of us haven't figured out yet." Behind them, the crumpled wanted poster remained buried beneath the stack of papers on Sheriff Morrison's desk, its faded text describing a man whose legendary skill with horses had made him famous throughout the territories. But fame, like all things, fades with time and distance, and sometimes legends walk among ordinary men without anyone recognizing them until the moment comes to remind the world why legends become legends in the first place. The procession toward the corrals moved with the solemn weight of a funeral march, though the atmosphere crackled with anticipation rather than grief. Cedar Falls had emptied itself onto the dusty path, leading behind Tom Fletcher's livery stable, where Hellfire waited in a reinforced corral that bore the scars of previous battles. Even before they could see him, they could hear him. The thunderous sound of hooves against hard-packed earth created a rhythm like war drums, punctuated by the sharp crack of wooden rails, taking punishment they were barely designed to withstand. Hellfire's angry snorts carried on the morning air, a sound that seemed to come from something wilder and more dangerous than any domesticated animal had a right to be. When the crowd crested the small rise that overlooked the corrals, a collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled townspeople. Hellfire stood 17 hands if he stood an inch, a magnificent and terrifying creature whose coal-black coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the morning sun. His mane flowed like dark water, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity. But it was the halter that caught Wes Carter's attention, an intricate piece of work that spoke of craftsmanship from hands that understood both horses and the old ways of managing them. The halter was made of leather that had been worked soft as silk and decorated with patterns that were distinctly Native American in origin. Beadwork in blues and whites formed geometric designs that weren't merely decorative but carried meaning in their arrangement. Silver conchos caught the light, and the leather itself had been treated with oils that gave it a deep, rich color that only came from years of careful maintenance. Tom Fletcher approached Carter with the reluctant gait of a man delivering bad news. "That there halter came with him," he said, following Carter's gaze. "Previous owners said it was made special by a Cheyenne horse trainer, blessed by their medicine man or some such. Course, that didn't help him none when Hellfire put him in the hospital for 3 weeks. Carter nodded thoughtfully, studying not just the horse, but everything about his situation. The corral had been reinforced with additional rails and corner braces that spoke to hard-learned lessons about containing something that didn't want to be contained. Scratch marks scored the wooden posts, and one section of fencing had been completely replaced, the new wood lighter in color than the weathered gray of the original construction. "What's his story?" Carter asked, though he kept his voice low enough that only Fletcher could hear. "Came from the Broken Circle Ranch up in Wyoming. Owner there was a man named Collins who thought he could make a fortune breeding wild horses to sell to the army. Hellfire was his prize stallion, caught him as a 2-year-old running with a wild herd in the Bighorn Mountains." Fletcher shook his head. "Collins spent 3 years trying to break him, brought in professional bronc busters from as far away as Texas. Every one of them ended up eating dirt, and 2 ended up eating it permanent-like." Carter absorbed this information while continuing his careful observation of the horse. Hellfire had stopped his aggressive pacing and now stood at the far side of the corral, watching the gathering crowd with ears pricked forward and nostrils flared. His attention seemed particularly focused on Carter, as if he sensed something different about this particular human. Ranch went under when Collins got himself killed, trying to prove he could ride his own horse. Fletcher continued. Widow sold off everything she could, but nobody wanted Hellfire. Too dangerous for breeding, too wild for riding, too mean for anything but dog food. Langley bought him for next to nothing, figured he might find some use for him eventually. And has he? Carter asked. Uses him for entertainment mostly. Whenever some cowboy gets too big for his britches, Langley brings out Hellfire, sort of a public reminder about the difference between confidence and foolishness. Around them, the crowd had arranged itself in a rough semicircle, maintaining a respectful distance from the corral, while positioning for the best view of what everyone expected would be a brief and violent spectacle. Langley had positioned himself prominently, his gold watch chain glinting as he checked the time with theatrical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," Langley called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "You're about to witness either an extraordinary display of horsemanship or an educational demonstration of why some challenges are best left to wiser men." Carter paid little attention to Langley's performance, instead focusing on the subtle signs that spoke to Hellfire's true nature. Despite his reputation for violence, the stallion's body language suggested intelligence rather than mere wildness. His ears remained forward rather than pinned back in anger, and his movements, while powerful, showed the controlled precision of an athlete rather than the frantic energy of a truly mad animal. More telling still was the way Hellfire's attention kept returning to Carter. The horse's dark eyes seemed to be evaluating him, measuring him in ways that went beyond simple threat assessment. It was the look of a creature that had been misunderstood for so long that he'd stopped expecting anything different, but hadn't quite given up hope that someday someone might see him for what he truly was. Maria Santos had positioned herself near the front of the crowd, her young face tight with worry. She caught Carter's eye and offered a small nod of encouragement that spoke volumes about her character and her family's gratitude for his intervention the day before. Her grandfather stood beside her, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, as if in prayer. "You sure about this, mister?" Doc Henley had approached Carter with his medical bag and the concerned expression of a man who'd seen too many broken bodies result from encounters between stubborn men and unforgiving animals. "I'm sure it needs to be done," Carter replied, which wasn't quite the same thing but seemed to satisfy the doctor's question. Martha Kellerman watched from the back of the crowd, her sharp eyes taking in details that others missed. She noticed the way Carter moved, the unconscious confidence that spoke of a man who'd spent significant time around horses. She saw how his hands remained steady despite the magnitude of the challenge he'd accepted, and how his breathing stayed deep and regular, even as nervous energy rippled through everyone around him. Most importantly, she noticed the subtle change in his demeanor since accepting the challenge. The humble drifter who'd eaten breakfast outside the general store had been replaced by someone else entirely, not arrogant or boastful, but quietly certain in a way that suggested reserves of competence he'd been careful to keep hidden. Chuck Morrison had positioned himself where his view would be unobstructed, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man about to witness long overdue justice. He'd recruited several of his friends to join him, and their conversations were loud enough to carry across the crowd. 2 minutes? Chuck laughed. He'll be lucky to last 2 seconds once he gets thrown. That horse has put men in the hospital who knew what they were doing. Strangers got sand, I'll give him that, one of his companions replied. Or maybe he's just too stupid to know better. Same thing in the end, Chuck said. Either way, we're about to see him get what's coming to him. Carter removed his hat and handed it to Tom Fletcher, running his fingers through his hair before pulling his worn gloves tighter on his hands. The leather was soft and supple, shaped by years of use into an extension of his own skin. These gloves had served him through countless challenges, and their familiar weight provided a comfort that had nothing to do with physical protection. Hellfire, he said quietly, the name carrying across the corral like a prayer or a promise. The stallion's ears twitched at the sound, and for just a moment his aggressive posturing seemed to falter. Langley consulted his pocket watch once more, the gesture designed to emphasize the precision of the challenge and his own control over events. "When you're ready, Mr. Carter." "The clock starts when you enter the corral." Carter approached the gate of the corral with steady steps, his gaze fixed on Hellfire, but his attention expanded to encompass everything: the condition of the rails, the footing inside the enclosure, the wind direction, the position of the sun. Every detail mattered when dealing with an animal that had earned his reputation through superior strength and intelligence. As his hand touched the gate latch, the crowd fell silent. Even the morning breeze seemed to still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Hellfire stood motionless at the far side of the corral, his dark coat gleaming and his powerful muscles coiled like steel springs waiting to be released. The moment had arrived, and everyone present understood they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Whether it would be remembered as tragedy or triumph remained to be seen, but no one doubted that the next few minutes would change everything for the quiet stranger who dared to challenge the established order of their small town. Carter lifted the latch and stepped into the corral, closing the gate behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the hushed morning air. Inside the corral, the world narrowed to just two beings, man and horse, each measuring the other with the careful attention that such encounters demanded. Carter stood still near the gate, allowing Hellfire to process his presence without adding the pressure of movement or aggressive posturing. The stallion's ears remained pricked forward, a sign that curiosity rather than fear dominated his initial response. The crowd beyond the rails seemed to fade into background noise as Carter focused entirely on the horse before him. Hellfire was indeed magnificent, but more than that, he carried himself with the dignity of a creature that had never truly been broken, only temporarily constrained. His eyes held an intelligence that suggested he understood exactly what was expected of him and had made a conscious choice to resist it. In his worn saddlebag, tucked beneath a spare shirt and the few personal items that constituted his worldly possessions, Carter carried a small silver button bearing the crossed sabers of the Union cavalry. It had been cut from his uniform the day he'd mustered out, a keepsake from a time when his skill with horses had served a larger purpose than mere survival. The button meant nothing to anyone else, but to Carter it represented years of training and experience that had shaped him into someone capable of understanding creatures like Hellfire. He'd learned his horsemanship during the war, when the survival of entire cavalry units depended on the bond between rider and mount. Those lessons had been written in blood and necessity, taught by men who understood that a horse was not simply transportation, but a partner whose trust could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The techniques he'd learned then went far beyond breaking an animal's will. They involved communication at a level that most people never imagined possible. "Easy, boy," Carter said softly, his voice carrying none of the harsh edge that Hellfire had learned to associate with human contact. "We're just getting acquainted." Martha Kellerman watched from beyond the fence with growing fascination. Something about Carter's approach struck her as fundamentally different from what she'd witnessed during previous attempts to ride Hellfire. Where other men had entered the corral with bravado and aggression, Carter moved with the patient deliberation of someone who understood that the real challenge lay not in conquering the horse, but in earning his cooperation. "He's not doing anything," Chuck Morrison complained loudly, "just standing there like he's afraid to get close." But Doc Henley, who possessed a keen understanding of both human and animal nature, recognized what Chuck could not. "He's listening," the doctor said quietly, "and more importantly, so is the horse." Indeed, Hellfire's aggressive posturing had given way to something approaching attention. His head remained high and alert, but the tension in his muscles had shifted from preparation for violence to readiness for communication. It was a subtle difference that spoke to Carter's ability to project calm authority rather than threatening dominance. Carter took a single step forward, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to walk among dangerous animals without triggering their defensive instincts. Hellfire responded by shifting his weight slightly, but made no move to retreat or attack. Their eyes remained locked in a conversation that required no words. The stallion's scarred halter told its own story of previous encounters with men who'd tried to impose their will through force and intimidation. The leather showed wear marks from ropes and chains, evidence of attempts to restrain rather than communicate. But beneath the scars, Carter could see the quality of the original workmanship. This had been crafted by hands that understood horses at a deeper level than most. "You've been misunderstood, haven't you?" Carter spoke in conversational tones, as if addressing an old friend rather than a supposedly dangerous animal. "Men have tried to break you when what you really needed was someone who spoke your language." Maria Santos found herself holding her breath as she watched the stranger's approach. There was something almost mystical in the way he moved, a quality that reminded her of her grandmother's stories about men who could speak with animals and understand their hearts. Her grandfather had often said that such gifts were rare but not impossible, and that they usually belonged to people who'd suffered enough to understand what it meant to be misunderstood. Another step forward brought Carter to the center of the corral, close enough now that Hellfire could have reached him with a single leap if the stallion had chosen violence. But instead of aggression, the horse showed increasing interest, his nostrils flaring as he took in Carter's scent and found nothing there to trigger alarm. Langley checked his pocket watch with growing impatience. The stranger's cautious approach was not providing the quick, violent entertainment he'd anticipated. "Any time you're ready, Mr. Carter," he called out. "The clock doesn't start until you actually attempt to ride the horse." Carter acknowledged the comment with a slight nod, but didn't alter his patient approach. He understood what Langley and most of the crowd did not, that the real work of riding Hellfire would be accomplished before he ever touched the horse's back. Everything depended on establishing the right relationship in these crucial first moments. Tom Fletcher watched with professional interest, his years of experience with horses giving him insight that the casual observers lacked. "I'll be damned," he muttered to Martha. "He's treating that stallion like a partner instead of an enemy." "Is that unusual?" Martha asked. "Around here, might as well be magic," Fletcher replied. "Most men try to prove they're tougher than the horse. This fellow's trying to prove he's smarter." Carter extended his hand slowly, palm open, allowing Hellfire to investigate if he chose. The gesture was an invitation rather than a demand, offering the horse the opportunity to make his own decision about contact. For a long moment, they remained motionless, man with hand extended, horse evaluating the offer. Then, with a movement so subtle that many in the crowd missed it entirely, Hellfire stretched his neck forward and allowed his muzzle to brush against Carter's outstretched palm. The contact lasted only seconds, but it represented a breakthrough that previous riders had never achieved. The touch revealed something that confirmed Carter's growing suspicions about this remarkable animal. Hellfire's muzzle was soft and warm, but more than that, there was an intentionality to the contact that spoke of intelligence and curiosity rather than mere instinct. This was not a mindless beast driven by rage, but a thinking creature that had learned to protect himself through aggression because gentleness had been met with betrayal too many times. "Good boy," Carter murmured, keeping his voice low and calm. "You remember what it's like to be treated with respect, don't you?" The crowd watched in fascination as Carter slowly moved his hand to stroke the stallion's neck, his movements careful but confident. Hellfire allowed the contact, his ears remaining forward and his body language suggesting acceptance rather than mere tolerance. It was a display of horsemanship that most of the observers had never seen before. Sheriff Morrison found himself remembering stories his grandfather had told about the old cavalry scouts, men who could gentle the wildest horses through patience and understanding rather than force. Those tales had always seemed like exaggerations, the kind of legends that grew in the telling, but watching Carter work made him reconsider what might be possible. "How long has it been since someone showed you kindness?" Carter asked the horse, his hand moving in slow, steady strokes along Hellfire's neck. The stallion's response was a soft snort that seemed almost like an answer too long, far too long. As Carter continued his gentle approach, memories surfaced unbidden from a time when his skill with horses had served a different purpose. During the war, he'd been responsible for training cavalry mounts that would carry men into battle, animals that needed to trust their riders completely because that trust might mean survival for both horse and man. He'd learned then that the strongest partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than dominance, a lesson that seemed to have been forgotten by most people who worked with horses. The silver cavalry button in his saddlebag was more than just a keepsake. It was a reminder of who he'd been before. Loss and grief had driven him to wander the territories like a ghost, seeking redemption. But standing here with Hellfire, feeling the horse's gradual acceptance of his presence, Carter found himself remembering not just the pain of what he'd lost, but the satisfaction of what he'd once been capable of accomplishing. Langley's impatience was becoming more evident as he consulted his watch yet again. "Mr. Carter, while your approach is certainly gentle, I believe the challenge was to ride the horse, not pet him." "All in good time, Mr. Langley," Carter replied without taking his attention off Hellfire. "Some things can't be rushed without ruining them entirely." The comment carried implications that went beyond horsemanship, and several people in the crowd exchanged meaningful glances. There was wisdom in Carter's words that spoke to life experience, to lessons learned through trials that had taught him the value of patience and proper preparation. Martha Kellerman found herself studying Carter's profile as he worked with the horse. There was something familiar about his bearing, a quality that nagged at her memory without quite revealing itself. She'd seen confident men before, but Carter's confidence was different, deeper, and more grounded, as if it came from knowledge rather than assumption. As Carter moved closer to Hellfire's side, running his hands along the stallion's powerful shoulders and barrel, he began to hum softly. The melody was an old cavalry song, something he'd learned during his service and found useful for calming nervous horses. The tune seemed to work its magic on Hellfire, whose breathing deepened and whose stance relaxed noticeably. "Well, I'll be switched," Tom Fletcher breathed. "That horse is actually enjoying himself." Indeed, Hellfire's transformation was remarkable. The aggressive, dangerous stallion that had terrorized previous riders was revealing himself to be an intelligent, responsive animal that had simply never been given the chance to show his true nature. Under Carter's patient touch, he stood quietly, allowing examination and contact that would have triggered violent reactions from any other person who'd tried. The crowd's mood began to shift as they witnessed something none of them had expected. What they'd come to see was a quick, violent demonstration of why certain challenges should never be accepted. Instead, they were watching a master horseman at work, displaying skills that most of them had only heard about in stories and legends. Young Pablo Santos pressed closer to the fence, his eyes wide with wonder. "Abuelo," he whispered to his grandfather, "the man talks to horses like you talk to me." Miguel Santos nodded slowly, his weathered face creased with understanding. "Some men have gifts, mijo, and some gifts only show themselves when they're needed most." Carter's hands found the special halter, running his fingers along the intricate beadwork and silver conchos. The craftsmanship was indeed exceptional, but more than that, he recognized the specific patterns and techniques used. This was the work of a Cheyenne horse trainer he'd known during his cavalry days, a man called Standing Bear, who taught him that truly great horsemanship required understanding the animal's spirit, rather than breaking it. "You know this halter, don't you, boy?" Carter said softly. "Someone who understood horses made this for you, someone who saw what you could be instead of what others tried to make you." Hellfire's response was unmistakable, a soft nicker of recognition that suggested the stallion did indeed remember gentler hands and kinder treatment from his past. The sound carried across the silent crowd like a revelation, proof that beneath the fearsome reputation lay an animal capable of trust and partnership. As Carter prepared to take the next crucial step in their developing relationship, he could feel the weight of history settling around him. This wasn't just about proving himself to Everett Langley or earning the right to stay in Cedar Falls. This was about remembering who he'd been before grief and loss had convinced him to hide his gifts, and perhaps discovering who he might become if he stopped running from the man he'd once been proud to be. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the corral, Carter continued his patient work with Hellfire. What had begun as a public challenge was transforming into something more intimate and profound, a conversation between two beings who'd both learned to be wary of trust, but hadn't forgotten how to recognize genuine intention. Doc Henley watched with growing amazement as Carter moved around the stallion with the fluid confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime understanding horses. His medical bag sat forgotten at his feet as he witnessed something he'd never expected to see. Hellfire allowing a human to examine him thoroughly without a single sign of the violence that had made him legendary throughout territory. "In 30 years of doctoring both people and animals," Doc Henley said to Martha, "I've never seen anything quite like this. That man isn't just good with horses, he's exceptional." Martha nodded, her sharp eyes taking in details that painted an increasingly clear picture of who Wes Carter might really be. His movements showed training that went beyond casual experience with ranch work. The way he positioned himself, the confidence of his touch, the unconscious competence with which he read Hellfire's responses, all of it spoke to professional education of the highest caliber. More revealing still was the medical bag that Doc Henley carried. Inside, wrapped in clean cloth and organized with the precision that came from years of emergency care, were supplies that would prove crucial in the hours to come. Bandages, laudanum for pain, needles and thread for stitching wounds, everything necessary to treat the injuries that everyone expected would result from this encounter. But as the minutes passed and Carter continued his gentle work, the doctor began to suspect his services might not be needed. After all, Carter had positioned himself at Hellfire's left side, running his hands along the stallion's withers and back with the systematic thoroughness of someone checking for old injuries or sensitive spots that might cause problems under saddle. What he found confirmed his growing understanding of this remarkable animal's history. Scars from poorly fitted tack marked Hellfire's back, evidence of men who'd tried to force equipment onto him without consideration for comfort or proper fit. Pressure sores from tight cinches told the story of riders who'd relied on harsh restraint rather than willing cooperation. Most telling of all were the rope burns around his neck and legs, proof of attempts to subdue him through brute force rather than communication. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" Carter murmured, his hands gentle over each mark of past trauma. Men who didn't understand that strength without wisdom is just another form of weakness. Hellfire's response was a soft rumble deep in his chest, almost like a cat's purr, but carrying the weight of an animal finally being understood. His head dropped slightly, and his eyes half-closed, universal horse language for contentment and trust. The transformation from dangerous stallion to willing partner was so complete that many in the crowd began to question whether they were looking at the same animal. Everett Langley found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable as the challenge he'd designed to humiliate the stranger took an unexpected turn. His gold pocket watch seemed to tick more loudly in the unusual quiet, each second marking not Carter's approaching defeat, but his own growing realization that he'd seriously misjudged his opponent. The watch had belonged to his father, then his grandfather before that, each generation adding their own stories to its history of measuring important moments. But as Langley watched Carter work with Hellfire, he began to suspect he was witnessing something that would be remembered long after his own moment of intended triumph was forgotten. "This isn't what was supposed to happen," Chuck Morrison muttered to his companions. The stranger was supposed to be thrown within seconds, providing entertainment and a clear lesson about the natural order of things. Instead, they were watching what looked more like a reunion between old friends than a confrontation between man and beast. "Maybe we got it wrong," one of his friends suggested quietly. "Maybe that fellow knows what he's doing after all." Chuck's response was a snort of derision, but it lacked conviction. What they were witnessing was beyond his experience or understanding, and that fact sat poorly with someone accustomed to having simple explanations for complex situations. Carter had begun the delicate process of checking Hellfire's legs, lifting each hoof to examine the condition of his shoes and the health of his feet. The stallion stood motionless, weight balanced on 3 legs while Carter worked, displaying the kind of trust that professional horsemen spend years trying to develop with their animals. As he worked, Carter found himself remembering another horse, another time, another place where his skill had mattered in ways that transcended simple horsemanship. During the war, he'd been assigned a mare named Stella, who'd been traumatized by artillery fire and had refused to let anyone approach her for weeks. The cavalry needed every mount they could get, so Carter had been given the task of either gentling her or recommending her destruction. It had taken him 3 days of patient work, but eventually Stella had learned to trust again. She'd carried him through some of the war's worst battles, saving his life more than once through her speed and intelligence. When the war ended, he'd bought her from the army and taken her home to the small farm where his wife and daughter were waiting. The memory brought pain, as it always did, but for the first time in years, Carter found himself able to focus on the good parts, the satisfaction of helping a damaged creature heal, the partnership that had developed between them, the pride he'd felt in work well done. Grief had taught him to remember only the endings, but Hellfire was reminding him that some stories had beautiful middles worth celebrating. Maria Santos watched from the crowd with growing understanding. Her grandmother had always insisted that some people carried gifts that went beyond normal human abilities, not magic exactly, but a deeper connection to the world around them. Watching Carter with Hellfire, Maria began to believe that her grandmother might have been right about such things. "Papa," she whispered to her father, "why do the other men not work with horses this way?" Miguel Santos considered his daughter's question carefully before answering. "Because this way requires patience, mija, and most men have convinced themselves that patience is weakness. They would rather fight than understand, would rather conquer than communicate." As Carter completed his examination of Hellfire, he stood back slightly and regarded the stallion with the satisfied expression of someone who'd confirmed his initial assessment. What he'd found was not a dangerous, unrideable animal, but a magnificent creature who'd never been given the chance to show what he was truly capable of achieving with the right partnership. The crowd had grown restless during the extended preparation, but their restlessness carried a different quality now. Instead of bloodthirsty anticipation, there was genuine curiosity about what would happen next. Even Chuck Morrison had stopped his derisive comments, perhaps beginning to suspect that his understanding of the situation might be incomplete. "Well, boy," Carter said to Hellfire, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd made his decision, "I think it's time we showed these people what real horsemanship looks like." The stallion's ears pricked forward at the change in Carter's tone, and his attention sharpened as if he understood that the moment of truth was approaching. Around the corral, the crowd pressed closer to the fence, sensing that whatever came next would be something worth remembering for the rest of their lives. Doc Henley picked up his medical bag, more from habit than expectation at this point, but his attention remained fixed on the man and horse at the center of the arena. Something told him that he was about to witness either the most remarkable display of horsemanship he'd ever seen, or the most catastrophic misjudgment in Cedar Falls history. Either way, it would be something to tell his grandchildren about, assuming he lived long enough to have grandchildren to tell. The morning had grown warm, and sweat beaded on the faces of the gathered crowd as they watched Carter prepare for the moment everyone had come to see. But the atmosphere around the corral had changed dramatically from the bloodsport anticipation that had brought them here. What they were witnessing felt more sacred than violent, more like a ceremony than a competition. Carter stood beside Hellfire, one hand resting on the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful heartbeat that pulsed just beneath the surface of that magnificent black coat. The horse's breathing was deep and steady, none of the nervous energy or aggressive tension that had marked his previous encounters with humans. Instead, there was an alertness that spoke to readiness rather than fear, partnership rather than conflict. In his worn saddlebag, forgotten beneath practical necessities, lay an old photograph that had traveled with him through years of wandering. The image showed a younger version of himself in Union cavalry blues, standing beside a woman whose smile could light up a room and holding a child whose laughter had once been the most beautiful sound in his world. The photograph was faded now, creased from handling, but it remained his most precious possession and his heaviest burden. Wesley Carton, as he'd been known then, had been called the Ghost Rider for his ability to move through enemy territory undetected, gathering intelligence that had helped turn the tide of several crucial battles. His skill with horses had been legendary, even among cavalry units known for their horsemanship. But that life, that identity, that pride in his abilities, all of it had been buried along with his family when influenza had taken them while he was away on a mission he couldn't abandon. Martha Kellerman had moved closer to the fence, her instincts telling her that something important was happening beyond the mere spectacle of man versus horse. She'd run the silver dollar long enough to recognize when someone was carrying secrets that weighed more than the law should allow, and everything about Carter suggested depths that his humble exterior couldn't fully conceal. The photograph in Carter's belongings wasn't just a family portrait, it was evidence of a man who'd once been somebody important, somebody whose name had appeared in dispatches and whose exploits had been reported in newspapers throughout the Union. But fame, like grief, could become a burden too heavy to bear, and sometimes the only escape was to disappear entirely into the anonymity of a wandering life. "Easy, boy," Carter murmured to Hellfire as he prepared to mount, but the words were as much for himself as for the horse, a reminder that some skills, once learned, never truly left a man's hands or heart, no matter how long he tried to forget them. Everett Langley consulted his pocket watch with increasing agitation. The stranger's methodical approach was making him look foolish, transforming his carefully planned public humiliation into something that reflected poorly on his understanding of both horses and men. The gold timepiece felt heavier in his hand, as if the weight of his miscalculation was affecting even his most treasured possessions. "Mr. Carter," Langley called out, his voice carrying an edge of impatience that didn't quite hide his growing uncertainty. "Perhaps you'd care to actually attempt the challenge sometime today." Carter glanced over at Langley with an expression that might have been sympathy. "I understand your impatience, Mr. Langley, but rushing this kind of work usually ends badly for everyone involved. A few more minutes won't hurt anyone." The response was delivered with such calm authority that Langley found himself nodding agreement before he realized what he was doing. There was something about Carter's presence, his complete confidence in his own judgment, that made arguing seem not just futile, but somehow inappropriate. Tom Fletcher watched the proceedings with the fascination of a professional observer. In 30 years of managing the livery stable, he'd seen every kind of horseman Cedar Falls had to offer, from competent ranch hands to genuine artists of the saddle. But Carter's approach was unlike anything in his experience. It combined the patience of a master trainer with the intuitive understanding that came from years of working with horses, whose cooperation could mean the difference between life and death. "Martha," Fletcher said quietly, "I'm starting to think we might be looking at someone with a considerable reputation in certain circles." "What kind of circles?" Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The kind where a man's skill with horses makes him valuable enough that people remember his name long after he's moved on. Around the corral, the crowd had settled into an expectant silence that carried more respect than the raucous anticipation that had marked the challenge's beginning. Even Chuck Morrison had stopped his derisive commentary, perhaps sensing that continued mockery might make him look foolish when events reached their conclusion. Carter placed his left hand on Hellfire's neck and reached up with his right to grasp the makeshift reins fashioned from the stallion's ornate halter. The movement was fluid and confident, without the jerky nervousness that marked most men when approaching dangerous animals. Hellfire stood quietly, his ears pricked forward with interest rather than pinned back in anger. "Here we go, boy," Carter said softly. "Let's show them what partnership looks like." The moment Carter's foot touched the stirrup, a makeshift arrangement fashioned from rope, the crowd held its collective breath. This was the instant when previous riders had found themselves airborne, victim to Hellfire's explosive rejection of human dominance. But as Carter swung his leg over the stallion's back and settled into position, something remarkable happened. Nothing. Hellfire stood perfectly still, his powerful body relaxed and ready, his attention focused not on bucking or bolting, but on the subtle signals from the man on his back. It was as if the horse understood that this time was different, this rider was different, this entire experience represented something new and worthy of his cooperation. Maria Santos pressed her hands to her heart, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was witnessing. Her grandmother's stories about men who could speak with animals had always seemed like folklore, but watching Carter and Hellfire together made those tales feel like historical accounts rather than fairy stories. Doc Henley set down his medical bag with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silent arena. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "He's actually going to ride that horse." But Carter wasn't just going to ride Hellfire, he was going to dance with him. As he settled more firmly into position and made his first request for movement, the stallion responded with the fluid grace of an animal that had been waiting his entire life for someone who understood his true nature. The first steps were tentative, both horse and rider testing their new partnership, but within moments it became clear that something extraordinary was unfolding. Hellfire moved with the controlled power of a creature finally free to show what he was capable of, while Carter rode with the unconscious competence of someone for whom such feats were simply another day's work. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the most dangerous horse in 3 counties transformed into the most magnificent, moving in harmony with a rider whose skills seemed to defy natural law. But for those with eyes to see, what was happening in that corral wasn't magic or luck. It was the result of knowledge, patience, and a deep understanding of what it took to build trust between 2 beings who'd both learned to be wary of the world's intentions. As Carter guided Hellfire through the first moments of their partnership, he felt something stirring inside him that had been dormant for years. Pride in his abilities, joy in his work, and the deep satisfaction that came from doing something exceptionally well. The grief and guilt that had driven him to wander were still there, but they no longer seemed quite so overwhelming when weighed against the reminder of who he'd once been and who he might yet become again. As Carter and Hellfire moved together in the corral with a grace that defied every expectation, Martha Kellerman found herself staring at the rider with growing recognition. Something about the way he sat his horse, the unconscious authority of his posture, the effortless communication between man and animal, it all pulled at memories she'd tried to dismiss as impossible. Martha had grown up in St. Louis during the war, working in her father's newspaper office where dispatches from the front lines crossed her desk daily. Among those reports had been stories of a Union cavalry scout whose exploits had become the stuff of legend, a man who could ride through Confederate territory like a ghost, gathering intelligence that had helped turn the tide of several crucial engagements. The Ghost Rider, they'd called him, and his real name had been Wesley Carton. But that had been 20 years ago, and Wesley Carton had disappeared after the war. vanishing into the same anonymity that claimed so many veterans who couldn't find their place in a world that no longer needed their particular skills. Still, watching Carter work with Hellfire, Martha found it impossible to dismiss the similarities between the man in the arena and the descriptions she remembered from those long-ago newspaper accounts. A tattered letter lay buried in Martha's personal effects upstairs in her private rooms above the saloon. A letter from a friend in St. Louis who'd written years ago with news about various acquaintances from their wartime days. Among the gossip and updates had been a mention of Wesley Ghost Rider Carton, reported to be wandering the Western Territories under an assumed name, broken by the loss of his family to disease while he'd been away on a mission that couldn't be abandoned. The letter had been forgotten until this moment, filed away with other correspondence that had seemed unimportant at the time. But watching Carter's extraordinary display of horsemanship, Martha began to suspect that Cedar Falls had been graced by the presence of a genuine legend, a man whose name belonged in the history books, but who'd chosen anonymity over the fame his accomplishments had earned. As Carter guided Hellfire through increasingly complex movements, demonstrating a level of communication with the stallion that transcended mere training, Martha made a decision that would change everything. She slipped away from the crowd, moving quietly toward the saloon with the determined stride of a woman who decided that some secrets were too important to keep. The letter was exactly where she'd left it, tucked between invoices and personal correspondence in the wooden box where she kept her private papers. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the yellowed pages, scanning the familiar handwriting until she found the passage that had suddenly become crucial. Wesley Carton, the famous Ghost Rider of the Union Cavalry, was reported seen in Denver last spring, though he was using the name Wesley Carter and seemed intent on avoiding recognition. Sarah McKenna, who knew him before the war, said he was still devastated by the loss of his wife and daughter to influenza in '64, and that he blamed himself for being away on military business when they died. She said he'd become a wanderer, taking odd jobs and moving on whenever people began to recognize his abilities with horses. Such a tragedy for a man who served his country so heroically. Martha's hands shook as she folded the letter and tucked it into her apron pocket. Wesley Carter. Wes Carter. The similarity in names had been obvious once she'd made the connection, and everything else fell into place like pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling since his arrival in town. She hurried back toward the corral, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. The humble drifter who'd defended little Pablo Santos wasn't just a man with a good heart and remarkable skills. He was one of the most celebrated cavalry scouts in Union history, a man whose exploits had been documented in military dispatches and newspaper accounts throughout the war. But he was also a man carrying a burden of grief and guilt so heavy that he'd abandoned his own identity rather than continue living with the weight of his reputation and his loss. The Ghost Rider had become a ghost in truth, haunting the territories in search of something redemption, perhaps, or simply the peace that had eluded him since the day he'd returned from his final mission to find his world destroyed. When Martha reached the corral, she found the crowd transfixed by a display of horsemanship that belonged more to legend than reality. Carter and Hellfire moved as one being, the stallion responding to signals so subtle that most observers couldn't detect them. What they were witnessing went beyond mere riding. It was poetry written in motion, a conversation between species that spoke to possibilities most people never imagined. "My God," Doc Henley breathed, his medical training forgotten in the face of something that transcended his understanding of what was possible between man and animal. "I've read about riding like this, but I never believed it was real." "It's real," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that made the doctor turn to look at her. "And so is the man doing it." Before Doc Henley could ask what she meant, Martha had pushed closer to the fence, her eyes fixed on Carter with an intensity that spoke of recognition and understanding. She waited until he guided Hellfire close to where she stood, then called out in a voice that carried clearly across the arena. Wesley Carton. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Carter's head snapped up, his eyes finding Martha's with an expression that combined shock, fear, and resignation. Hellfire, responding to his rider's sudden tension, pranced slightly but remained under perfect control, a testament to the partnership they'd established even in this moment of revelation. "I thought that might be you," Martha continued, her voice gentle but carrying enough volume that others in the crowd could hear. "The Ghost Rider himself, come to Cedar Falls." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the name registered with those who remembered the war stories. Chuck Morrison's jaw dropped open, and even Everett Langley found himself staring at the man in the arena with new understanding and no small amount of apprehension. Carter Wesley Carton sat perfectly still atop Hellfire, his weathered face showing the weight of a secret that had just been stripped away. For a moment, the arena was frozen in tableau. Legendary rider on magnificent horse, surrounded by townspeople who were suddenly seeing both man and animal in an entirely different light. "I reckon," Carter said finally, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "that some secrets have a way of coming out when they're meant to." The admission confirmed what Martha's letter had suggested and what his display of horsemanship had proven. Cedar Falls had been host to one of the most famous horsemen in American history, a man whose name belonged alongside the great cavalry leaders of the war. But they'd also been witness to something more human and more poignant, the sight of a broken man rediscovering abilities he'd tried to bury. Remembering who he'd been before, grief convinced him that he had no right to pride or joy or the satisfaction of work well done. As the implications of the revelation settled over the crowd, it became clear that the morning's challenge had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. What had begun as Everett Langley's attempt to humiliate a troublesome stranger had become the moment when a legend stepped out of the shadows and reclaimed his place in the world. But the question remained: what would Wesley Ghost Rider Carton do now that his carefully maintained anonymity had been shattered? And what would it mean for Cedar Falls to discover that they'd been judging not just any drifter, but one of the most celebrated horsemen of his generation? The answers to those questions would shape everything that followed. But for now, the crowd could only watch in amazement as history unfolded in their small town's dusty arena. The revelation of Carter's true identity sent ripples of shock and awe through the assembled crowd, but it was Hellfire's response that truly captured everyone's attention. As his rider's tension communicated itself through their connection, the stallion's ears pricked forward with increased alertness, and his movements took on an even more refined quality. It was as if the horse sensed that he was no longer carrying just any skilled rider, but someone whose reputation with horses was the stuff of legend. Martha's recognition had stripped away the carefully maintained anonymity that Wesley Carton had worn like armor for 20 years. But instead of shame or anger, something unexpected began to emerge in his bearing. The humble posture of the wandering drifter gradually gave way to the unconscious authority of a man who'd once been entrusted with missions that could affect the outcome of battles. His seat in the saddle shifted subtly, taking on the precision and confidence that had made him famous among cavalrymen from Virginia to California. Everett Langley found himself in the uncomfortable position of realizing that his carefully planned humiliation had backfired spectacularly. Not only had the stranger proven capable of riding Hellfire, but he'd revealed himself to be one of the most celebrated horsemen of the age. The gold pocket watch in Langley's vest suddenly felt like a child's toy compared to the weight of history that surrounded the man in the arena. "The Ghost Rider," Doc Henley repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "I read about him in Harper's Weekly during the war. They said he could ride through enemy lines like he was invisible, gathering intelligence that helped win some of the most important battles of the campaign." The crowd pressed closer to the fence, no longer motivated by the expectation of violence, but by the rare privilege of witnessing a living legend at work. Stories that had seemed like exaggerations when read in old newspapers suddenly took on new credibility as they watched Wesley Carton demonstrate skills that went far beyond anything they'd previously imagined possible. But it was the special halter that Hellfire wore that provided the final piece of the puzzle. As Carton's hands worked with the ornate leather and silver conchos, his touch revealed the kind of familiarity that came only from long acquaintance. The war bridle wasn't just a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, it was a tool that Carton recognized and understood at a level that spoke to shared history. "Standing Bear's work," Carton said quietly, though his words carried clearly in the hushed arena. His fingers traced the intricate beadwork with the reverence of a man handling a sacred artifact. "I knew a Cheyenne horse trainer who made bridles like this during the war. We worked together training cavalry mounts for the Army of the Potomac." The halter represented more than just superior craftsmanship. It embodied a philosophy of horsemanship that emphasized partnership over dominance, communication over force. Standing Bear had taught Carton that the greatest riders were those who learned to think like their horses, to understand the animal's needs and fears and desires at such a deep level that riding became a form of conversation rather than conquest. "This bridle was made for a horse like Hellfire," Carton continued, his voice taking on the authority of someone who understood the deeper implications of what he was handling. "Not to control him, but to communicate with him, to let him know that his rider was worthy of his partnership." Tom Fletcher watched with growing amazement as the legendary horseman worked with tools that had been crafted specifically for such partnerships. "That's why he's been so difficult," Fletcher breathed. "He's been waiting for someone who understood what that bridle really meant." Indeed, Hellfire's transformation continued to astonish everyone present. The stallion that had terrorized previous riders was revealing himself to be an animal of extraordinary intelligence and sensitivity, one whose violent reputation had stemmed not from inherent viciousness, but from years of being misunderstood and mistreated by men who lacked the knowledge to communicate with him properly. As Carton prepared to demonstrate the full extent of what was possible between a master horseman and a truly gifted horse, he found himself remembering the day Standing Bear had presented him with a similar bridle. It had been during the winter of 1863, when both armies were settled into winter quarters, and there was time for the kind of detailed training that separated adequate cavalry from exceptional units. "This bridle carries the spirit of partnership," Standing Bear had told him, his weathered hands reverent as he handled the intricate leatherwork. "Horse and rider must become one being, thinking as one, moving as one. Only then will you both survive what is coming." Those words echoed across 20 years as Carton felt Hellfire's powerful muscles coiled beneath him, ready to demonstrate what true partnership could accomplish. The stallion's breathing had synchronized with his own, and their heartbeats seemed to match in rhythm that spoke to the deep connection that could exist between species when understanding replaced dominance. Maria Santos watched with tears in her eyes, recognizing something sacred in what she was witnessing. Her grandmother's stories about men who could speak with animals had never seemed more real or more beautiful than at this moment, when legend and reality merged in the dusty arena of a small Colorado town. "Abuelo," young Pablo whispered to his grandfather. "Is he magic?" Miguel Santos considered his grandson's question seriously before answering. "Not magic, mijo, something better. Something that comes from understanding and respect, and many years of learning how to listen with more than just your ears." The crowd had grown to include virtually every resident of Cedar Falls, drawn by word that spread faster than prairie fire through the small community. What they were witnessing was more than just an exhibition of horsemanship. It was a glimpse into possibilities that most of them had never imagined, a reminder that there were still mysteries in the world worth celebrating. Sheriff Morrison found himself thinking about the wanted posters that accumulated on his desk, descriptions of men whose crimes had made them famous in all the wrong ways. But here was a different kind of fame, earned through skill and service, and the kind of courage that protected others rather than preying upon them. It made him wonder about the stories that never made it into the official reports, the quiet heroism that happened far from newspapers and recognition. Chuck Morrison stood silent now, his earlier mockery forgotten in the face of something that transcended his understanding. The man he'd tried to humiliate was revealing himself to be someone whose reputation would outlast all of them, whose name would be remembered long after Cedar Falls itself was forgotten. It was a humbling realization for someone who'd thought the world was simple enough to be understood through force and intimidation. Carton's hands moved with subtle precision on the ornate reins, communicating requests that were more like suggestions than commands. Hellfire responded with the fluid grace of an animal finally free to show his true capabilities, his powerful body moving with the controlled elegance that came from perfect understanding between horse and rider. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carton called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded cavalry units in the heat of battle. "What you're about to see is not a man conquering a horse. It's two partners working together to create something beautiful." The words were delivered without boastfulness, simply a statement of fact from someone who understood exactly what he was capable of achieving. But they carried an undercurrent of profound sadness, as if Carton was remembering not just his skills, but everything he'd lost that had once made those skills meaningful. Everett Langley watched with growing dismay as his challenge transformed into something that reflected poorly on his own understanding of both horses and men. The 2 minutes he'd demanded seemed almost insulting now, like asking a master musician to prove himself by playing a simple scale. What was unfolding in the arena was artistry of the highest caliber, and everyone present understood they were privileged to witness it. As Carton prepared to demonstrate the full extent of what was possible when legendary skill met exceptional animal, Hellfire seemed to grow larger beneath him, the stallion's magnificent frame expanding with pride and anticipation. The horse had spent years being seen as a problem to be solved rather than a partner to be celebrated, and Carton's recognition of his true nature was transforming him before everyone's eyes. The morning sun had reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows that would make the coming display even more dramatic. Every person present understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary, something that would become part of Cedar Falls folklore and be talked about for generations to come. But for Wesley Carton, the moment represented something even more profound. For the first time in 20 years, he was about to stop hiding from who he'd been and embrace the skills that had once made him proud. The grief and guilt that had driven him into anonymity were still there, but they no longer seemed quite so overwhelming when weighed against the joy of remembering what it felt like to excel at something he loved. As he gathered the reins and felt Hellfire's eager response, Carton whispered a prayer to the memory of his lost family, not for forgiveness this time, but for the strength to honor their memory by being the best version of himself he could manage. Then he touched his heels to Hellfire's sides, and together they began to dance. The first movement was so subtle that some in the crowd almost missed it, a gentle shift of weight, a barely perceptible touch of rain, and Hellfire began to move with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone. But this was no ordinary riding, no simple demonstration of staying aboard a difficult horse. This was artistry made manifest, the kind of partnership between species that poets write about but few ever witness. Hellfire's hooves barely seemed to touch the ground as he moved into a collected trot that showcased every line of his magnificent frame. His neck arched with pride, his tail flowing like a banner, his powerful hindquarters driving him forward with the controlled energy of a coiled spring, releasing its power in perfect increments. But it was the expression in the stallion's eyes that truly captured the crowd's attention, no longer the wild defiance of an untamed creature, but the focused intelligence of an animal, finally given the chance to show what he could accomplish with the right partner. Wesley Carton sat his horse with the unconscious perfection of someone for whom such riding had become second nature decades ago. His posture was erect but relaxed, his hands steady but gentle, his entire being in harmony with the powerful animal beneath him. Gone was any trace of the humble drifter who'd wandered into town 3 days ago. In his place sat a master horseman, displaying skills that belonged to legend rather than ordinary experience. The transformation was so complete that Martha Kellerman found herself wondering if she was looking at the same person who'd eaten breakfast outside the general store that morning. The revealed identity of the Ghost Rider had somehow unlocked not just his name, but his true nature, allowing the man he'd once been to emerge from the protective anonymity he'd maintained for 20 years. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," breathed Tom Fletcher, his professional eye recognizing nuances of horsemanship that exceeded anything in his considerable experience. "That's not riding, that's flying with your feet on the ground." Indeed, as Carton guided Hellfire through increasingly complex movements, it seemed as if the laws of physics had been suspended in favor of something more beautiful. The stallion responded to signals so subtle that most observers couldn't detect them, his transitions from gait to gait as smooth as silk, sliding across marble. What they were witnessing went beyond mere training to touch something approaching the miraculous. But it was Hellfire's spirit that truly captivated everyone present. The wild essence that had made him legendary throughout the territory was still there, but instead of being suppressed or broken, it had been channeled into something magnificent. His power remained undiminished, but it was now directed toward partnership rather than resistance, cooperation rather than conflict. The stallion seemed to grow more magnificent with each movement, as if Carton's recognition of his true nature was allowing him to become fully himself for the first time. His coal-black coat gleamed in the morning sun, his muscles rippled with controlled strength, and his bearing spoke to the aristocratic bloodlines that had produced such exceptional ability. Doc Henley stood transfixed, his medical bag forgotten at his feet. In 30 years of treating both humans and animals, he'd developed an appreciation for the mechanics of movement, the complex interplay of muscle and bone and sinew that made locomotion possible. But what he was witnessing transcended mere mechanics to enter the realm of art. The crowd had grown absolutely silent, afraid that any sound might break the spell that had transformed their dusty arena into a theater for miracles. Even the horses tied at the nearby hitching posts stood motionless, their attention fixed on the display of horsemanship that seemed to speak to something deep in their equine understanding. As Carton asked for more complex movements, Hellfire's responses revealed the extent of his natural ability. Extended trots that covered ground with breathtaking efficiency, collected gaits that demonstrated perfect balance and control, lateral movements that showcased the stallion's athletic ability and willingness to trust his rider's guidance completely. "Look at his face," Maria Santos whispered to her father, pointing at Hellfire's expression. "He's happy." Indeed, the stallion's entire demeanor spoke to joy rather than mere compliance. His ears remained pricked forward with interest, his eyes bright with intelligence and engagement, his movements flowing with the natural rhythm of an animal finally free to demonstrate what he'd always been capable of achieving. For Wesley Carton, the experience was both familiar and revelatory. The skills came flooding back, as if no time had passed since his cavalry days, muscle memory and hard-won knowledge combining to create the kind of effortless competence that only comes from years of dedicated practice. But more than that, he was remembering the pure joy that had originally drawn him to horses, the satisfaction of perfect communication, the thrill of partnership with another species, the pride that came from doing something exceptionally well. The guilt and grief that had driven him into exile were still there, but they seemed smaller now, less overwhelming when balanced against the reminder of what he was capable of contributing to the world. Perhaps his family's memory could be better honored by embracing his gifts rather than hiding from them. by using his abilities to create beauty rather than burying them in shame. As horse and rider moved together in perfect harmony, Everett Langley felt the full weight of his miscalculation settling around him like a lead cloak. What he'd intended as a public humiliation had become something approaching a religious experience for everyone present, a reminder that there were still wonders in the world worth celebrating and skills worth preserving. The 2 minutes he'd demanded had already passed unnoticed, the arbitrary time limit rendered meaningless by the artistry unfolding in the arena. No one was counting seconds anymore. They were all too busy witnessing something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. A demonstration of what was possible when legend met reality and proved that some stories were too magnificent to be mere exaggeration. As the display continued, something even more extraordinary began to unfold. The harmony between Wesley Carton and Hellfire deepened into something that transcended mere horsemanship, becoming a conversation conducted in a language older than words. The stallion began to anticipate his rider's requests, responding to intentions rather than commands, his movements flowing with the kind of perfect synchronization that spoke to a spiritual connection between two remarkable beings. Carton's hands barely moved on the reins now, his communication with Hellfire conducted through subtle shifts of weight, gentle pressure from his legs, and the kind of mental focus that experienced horsemen learned to project. The stallion read these signals with the precision of a musician following a conductor, his responses immediate and elegant, his powerful body moving with the fluid grace that only came from complete trust and understanding. The crowd watched in stunned silence as horse and rider performed movements that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Hellfire moved sideways with the precision of a dancer, his legs crossing in patterns that showcased both his natural athleticism and his willingness to attempt anything his partner requested. He spun in place like a weather vane, finding true north, his hooves marking perfect circles in the dust while his body remained balanced and controlled. But it was when Carton asked for the passage, a movement where the horse appeared to float above the ground in slow motion, that the true magic revealed itself. Hellfire's powerful hindquarters coiled and released in rhythm, driving him forward in a gait that seemed to suspend the normal rules of movement. His hooves touched the earth so briefly that he appeared to be dancing on air, his magnificent frame moving with the otherworldly beauty that had made such movements the province of kings and emperors in centuries past. "Dear God," Martha Kellerman whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Indeed, what was unfolding in the dusty arena of Cedar Falls transcended mere entertainment to become something approaching the sacred. The partnership between man and horse had achieved a level of perfection that spoke to possibilities most people never imagined, a reminder that there were still miracles in the world for those who had the patience and skill to reveal them. Young Pablo Santos pressed against the fence, his eyes wide with wonder that would shape his dreams for years to come. He was witnessing something that would become part of his personal mythology, a moment of pure magic that would remind him for the rest of his life that the world contained wonders beyond ordinary understanding. Tom Fletcher found himself thinking about all the horses that had passed through his care, all the riders he'd watched over the years, and realizing that none of it had prepared him for what he was witnessing now. This wasn't just superior horsemanship, this was artistry at a level that belonged in palaces rather than frontier corrals. As Carton guided Hellfire through the final movements of their impromptu performance, both horse and rider seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the morning sun. They moved as a single being, their separate identities merged into something greater than either could achieve alone, their partnership a testament to what was possible when skill met understanding, and both were seasoned with genuine respect. The stallion's joy was unmistakable now, his entire being radiating the satisfaction of an artist finally given the canvas worthy of his talents. His movements had taken on an almost playful quality, as if he was showing off for the crowd that had gathered to witness his supposed defeat, but had instead been privileged to see his triumph. For Wesley Carton, the moment represented more than just a display of preserved skills. It was a resurrection, a return to the man he'd been before. Grief convinced him that he had no right to joy or pride or the satisfaction of work well done. The connection with hellfire had awakened something in him that had been dormant for 20 years, reminding him that some gifts were too precious to waste on guilt and self-recrimination. As they completed their final movement, a perfect halt that left hellfire standing like a statue carved from living obsidian, the silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. The crowd stood transfixed, afraid that applause might somehow diminish what they'd witnessed, that any sound might break the spell that had transformed their ordinary morning into something extraordinary. Then, slowly, the spell began to lift. But instead of the wild cheering that might have followed a mere display of skill, what emerged was something more reverent, a soft murmur of awe and gratitude, the sound of people who understood they'd been privileged to witness something rare and beautiful and worthy of their deepest respect. Carton dismounted with fluid grace, his hand remaining on Hellfire's neck as he addressed the crowd for the first time since Martha's revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent arena. "This is what's possible when we choose partnership over dominance, understanding over force, patience over haste. Hellfire isn't a dangerous animal who needed to be broken. He's a magnificent creature who needed to be understood." The words carried implications that went far beyond horsemanship, touching on themes of respect and communication and the kind of wisdom that came from learning to see the world through other eyes. It was a lesson that would resonate in Cedar Falls long after the dust from Hellfire's hooves had settled, and the memory of this morning had transformed into legend. The silence that followed Wesley Carton's words seemed to stretch across eternity, but it was Everett Langley who finally broke it. The wealthy rancher stepped forward, his gold pocket watch forgotten in his vest, as he approached the man who'd just transformed his intended humiliation into something approaching a miracle. "Mr. Carton," Langley said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had marked his earlier pronouncements, "I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my respect." The admission cost him something, this public acknowledgement that he'd misjudged both the man and the situation so completely. But watching the display of horsemanship had stripped away his pretenses, leaving him face to face with the reality that true greatness had nothing to do with wealth or position or the ability to intimidate others. "No apology necessary, Mr. Langley," Carton replied, his hand still resting gently on Hellfire's neck. "We all make judgments based on incomplete information. What matters is what we do when we learn better." The grace of the response, the complete absence of vindictiveness or triumph, somehow made Langley's defeat more complete than any gloating could have accomplished. Here was a man who'd proven his superiority so thoroughly that he could afford to be generous, whose confidence was so deep that he felt no need to diminish others to elevate himself. Chuck Morrison found himself shuffling forward, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching shame. "Mr. Carton," he said, his voice barely audible, "I was wrong about you, about everything. I'm sorry. Takes courage to admit when we're wrong," Carton replied, offering the younger man a nod that suggested forgiveness without condescension. "That's the first step toward becoming better than we were." The crowd began to disperse gradually, but their movement was reluctant, as if they were afraid that leaving would somehow diminish what they'd experienced. Conversations buzzed with excitement and wonder, but even the most talkative seemed to understand that words were inadequate to capture what they'd witnessed. Doc Henley approached with his medical bag, though it was clear his services wouldn't be needed. "Mr. Carton," he said, extending his hand, "it's been an honor to witness what you've accomplished here today. Cedar Falls is privileged to have you among us." "The privilege is mine, Doc," Carton replied, accepting the handshake with genuine warmth. "This town has good people who deserve to be treated with respect." As the immediate crowd thinned, Martha Kellerman found herself standing beside the man whose secret she'd revealed. "I hope I didn't overstep by calling you out," she said, "but watching you with that horse, I couldn't help but remember the stories from the war." Carton was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered her words. 20 years, he said finally. 20 years I've been running from who I used to be, convinced that I had no right to pride or joy or the satisfaction of work well done. Maybe it's time I stopped running. What will you do now? Martha asked. Before he could answer, Maria Santos approached with her father and young Pablo. The boy's eyes were still wide with wonder, and he clutched his grandfather's hand tightly as they drew near. "Señor Carton," Miguel Santos said formally, "my family owes you a debt that cannot be repaid, not just for defending my grandson, but for showing us what's possible when good men choose to act with courage and honor." "The debt is mine," Carton replied, his attention focusing on young Pablo. "Your grandson reminded me that some things are worth standing up for, regardless of the cost." Pablo stepped forward shyly, his small hand extended toward Hellfire. The stallion lowered his magnificent head, allowing the boy to stroke his muzzle with the gentle touch that children seem to understand instinctively. "Will you teach me to ride like that?" Pablo asked, his voice filled with the kind of hope that only children could muster. Carton glanced at Maria Santos, whose nod of permission came with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I'd be honored to teach you, son. But it takes patience and respect and a willingness to listen with more than just your ears." "I can do that," Pablo said with the solemn certainty of childhood. "I want to learn to talk to horses like you do." Tom Fletcher had approached during this exchange, his professional interest evident. "Mr. Carton, if you're planning to stay in Cedar Falls, I could use a man with your abilities. The livery stable has more business than I can handle properly, and there are horses throughout the territory that could benefit from your kind of training." The offer represented more than just employment. It was an invitation to build a new life, to put down roots in a community that had witnessed his abilities and chosen to embrace rather than exploit them. For a man who'd spent 20 years drifting from place to place, the prospect of belonging somewhere again carried weight that had nothing to do with wages or working conditions. "I'll consider your offer seriously," Carton replied. "Cedar Falls has proven to be a place where a man can discover who he's meant to be." As the morning stretched toward noon, the crowd had largely dispersed, leaving only the principals of the morning's drama still gathered around the corral. Hellfire stood quietly beside Carton, the stallion's transformation from dangerous beast to willing partner now complete and permanent. The special halter that had been crafted by Standing Bear decades ago had found its proper purpose, at last connecting a legendary horseman with an exceptional animal in the kind of partnership that both had been waiting for without knowing it. Everett Langley approached one final time, his manner subdued but sincere. "Mr. Carton, I'd like to make you an offer. Hellfire is yours, if you'll have him. Consider it a gesture of respect from a man who's learned something important about the difference between power and wisdom." The generosity of the offer, coming from someone who'd intended to humiliate him just hours before, spoke to the transformative power of witnessing genuine excellence. Langley had seen something in the arena that had changed his understanding of what was possible, and his response was to ensure that such possibilities could continue to flourish. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Langley," Carton replied, his hand moving to stroke Hellfire's neck. "I accept, with gratitude." As the sun reached its zenith and the shadows shortened around the corral, Wesley Carton found himself facing a future that looked remarkably different from the aimless wandering that had defined his past 20 years. He had a home, if he chose to accept it. He had work that would allow him to use his gifts in service of something worthwhile. Most importantly, he had remembered who he was beneath the grief and guilt that had driven him into exile. The morning had begun with a challenge designed to put him in his place, but it had ended with the discovery that his place wasn't as a humble drifter seeking anonymity. His place was here, in Cedar Falls, using his legendary skills to train horses and teach young people like Pablo Santos that some dreams were worth pursuing regardless of how impossible they might seem. Standing beside Hellfire in the warm Colorado sunshine, surrounded by people who'd chosen to see his worth rather than judge his appearance, Wesley Carton understood that sometimes losing everything is simply the first step toward finding something better. The Ghost Rider had finally stopped running, and in stopping, had discovered that home wasn't a place but a choice. The choice to belong, to contribute, to allow himself the pride and joy that came from doing what he was born to do. Behind them, Cedar Falls buzzed with conversations that would continue for years, stories that would be told and retold until they became legend. But the real story wasn't about a famous horseman's miraculous ride. It was about a community that had chosen compassion over judgment, a broken man who'd rediscovered his purpose, and a magnificent animal who'd finally found the partner he'd been waiting for all his life. Some endings, Wesley Carton reflected as he led Hellfire toward his new home, are really just beginnings in disguise.